So today we're going to step back a little bit, take a higher perspective and look at things more broadly, and then addiction and all the different types of addiction in context. So, as I've spoken to before, the latest research around addiction tells us, and Dr. Gabor Mate is the expert on this, that addiction is the result of complex childhood trauma. Now, many of us initially don't relate to that because we're like, oh, I had a perfect childhood. And absolutely, I didn't. So, to be clear, there's big T's and there's little T's, and then there's what's missing when we look at, say, Pia Melody's developmental model. So, when I talk about complex childhood trauma, I'm talking about there's obviously the big things, like a death of a family, sexual abuse, that type of thing, which has a huge impact on the child's mind because in those formative years, in 0 to 9, our synapses are being pruned in our mind. So, who we are in context of the world and whether we think we're worthy of love, all of that's all coming together. So, abuse and also the lack of emotional needs being met in those formative years really is very consequential, and this is what plays out in these maladaptive behaviors later in life. So, big T's, and again, it's not the actual event. I have a client where there was the death of the father which was very traumatic, but more not being supported or loved going through that was what caused the more significant trauma to him in his sense of self and feeling safe in the world, and that's what it's about, feeling safe in the world. And so we've got the big T's, we've got the little T's, which has been told that you're dumb, that you're stupid, often comes through bullying, other key people who play a role in our formative years, and not necessarily our parents, but sometimes them. And why it's an epidemic of this era also is because in other years we were raised by not just mum and dad, but and different cultures are obviously different, but I'll speak from an Australian Western perspective. You might have aunties and uncles and indigenous cultures. You can have all the tribe and the elders and everybody else contributing to helping you become a great little human and a human who can really cope with the world without, intravenous drug use or alcoholism or toxic relationships. So it's a societal issue that we have trauma and big T's and little T's. And in terms of little T's, we also look at the core emotional needs not being met around vulnerable, invulnerable, being worthy of love. Often men that I work with that end up with porn and sex addictions, there's a true, at their essence, not worthy of love, is a really big one. A lot of women grow up thinking, they're just too much, they're too sensitive, because that idea in context of who they are in the world, because when they were younger, they were told that they shouldn't have emotions. It wasn't acceptable to be angry, to be sad, to not be a nice little girl. Now, this all plays out later in life in addictive behaviors of any type, so numbing, dumbing, and distracting, because we don't feel safe at our core in who we are. We're not safe. We don't feel good and calm and serene. And so there's this constant escapism through drugs, through porn, through, chemical or process addictions. And I've been speaking a little bit recently about people, codependency in people. So codependency is another way that it can be an addiction that is shared with one another, or can be addiction on its own. But codependency and toxic is one of the traits of very unhealthy relationships. And if you look at the unhealthy kind of relationship triangle, kind of 101, you look at victim, perpetrator, and the rescuer. So if you're in an unhealthy relationship dynamic, you are fulfilling one of those roles, or moving around the triangle, or maybe all three. So if you think about it, a really good, healthy relationship, when there's conflict, the idea of resolving the conflict is the end goal, not winning, not being the victim or being, persecuted or, rescuing the other person. So when we look at codependent relationships as an aspect of being in that unhealthy drama triangle, I'm going to just refer, because I think actually ChatGPT gives a really nice, clear definition of this. So codependency is a type of unhealthy relationship dynamic, that much we've established. Key traits of codependency: people-pleasing, lack of boundaries, low self-esteem, caretaking, and this is, again, as I've said in another video, to the detriment of your own mental health, not just being beautiful and loving and caring and kind. Fear of abandonment and control issues. So this is where we can get into really toxic relationship traits, and that is that fear of abandonment, so staying regardless of how unhealthy or unhappy you are. One person controlling the other. And what happens in these toxic relationships is it's a very unsafe emotional environment. And so if you grew up with a level of complex childhood trauma, that being active trauma or more passively not having your needs met, you're used to an environment that isn't safe. So what we do as humans when we're looking for safety is we go for the familiar. But if we grew up in a house that was inconsistent and unsafe, then what familiarity looks like is actually not safe, because it's the subconscious looking for that familiarity. And that's how people go from toxic relationship to toxic relationship to toxic relationship, and wanting to escape who they are through drugs. So when I talk about recovery from addiction and complex trauma, because addiction being the symptom of complex trauma, when I talk about true recovery, what I'm talking about is not just putting down the drink or the drug or getting out of that relationship, but it's healing those deeper wounds of being able to find emotional safety within yourself. And that's done, as I discuss in other videos, because otherwise this would get really long, in terms of nurturing mind, body, and spirit, building a life around the pillars of great mental health. So sleeping well, eating well, time in nature, connecting, really connecting with others, being in tribe, moving your body, these things are so important. And when also we're in service, when we're doing work that's purposeful, esteemable actions build self-esteem. So then we get to like who we are. You don't have to escape. You don't have to escape when you feel safe, when you're in a healthy relationship, when you like who you are. You don't need to go and pick up the needle. So it's not that simple, but trying to keep it under 10 minutes here. There's some of the fundamentals of how complex trauma leads to unhealthy relationship patterns, codependency, and toxic relations in general. Love to hear your thoughts. Please, there's a beautiful community building here. Please subscribe, like, join in the conversation, and wonderful to have you here.